Great first carrier update from Thomas Watson. Right now, we're going to welcome our first guest, as he mentioned, John Gallagher. John, thanks for joining us this morning.
Sure. Thanks, Anthony, for having me.
So, John, starting it off, what's going on with the FMCSA? What's this latest story here?
Yeah, this is a story I'm following this morning, Anthony. I basically, so the FMCSA created it's called a coercion rule back in 2016, and it was to try to respond to complaints by a lot of people, but mainly the focus was drivers that were complaining about being coerced to violate FMCSA regulations, and it could have been either by their employer, or it could be by shippers or brokers or warehouses, pressure to get stuff delivered and potentially break rules. But so with the rule, the agency also opened up this, started taking complaints to be filed either online or by mail on these different types of coercion issues. So late last week, I asked the FMCSA for the data on that, and it looks like that in 2022 we're going to be in for like a record year of these complaints. In 2019, there was close to 1,000 of these complaints filed, and now, based on the first 14 weeks of this year, so we've got about 500 complaints filed so far this year. So if you sort of extrapolate out that pace, it's going to be easily break that 1,000 record. Like 1,800 plus is sort of the number if that pace continues. So, and since 2018, they break it out a little bit too. Since 2018, when the ELD rule came into force, they started separating out coercion complaints specifically related to ELD coercion to violate the ELD rule. And then they block it out into non-ELD complaints. So since 2018, I showed this, I put a chart in there too. So since 2018, there's sort of you've got ELD and non-ELD complaints. They sort of, there's not a bit in terms of, they sort of go up and down, but they're, in terms of comparison to each other, they stay basically the same. But so I mean, it's obviously a big safety issue, with fatigue being like a big consequence of being pressured to break rules if you're too tired. I talked to a supply chain expert at the University of Maryland, and he says fatigue is still a huge issue. He actually represents families of people that were killed in some of these crashes where the NTSB said the primary cause was fatigue. These drivers driving while too tired. So I guess the big question, though, obviously the big sort of obvious question is why are they going up so much? And I didn't get a chance to get a lot of feedback on that. I think it would be a good kind of sort of a follow-up story, Anthony. But it might not be any one reason, obviously. How much the economy might be at play here. Thomas just mentioned the uptick in number, this big surge of drivers that we've had. So it could just be sort of it could be a function of that, the reason we're getting this big surge of complaints as well. I imagine it's a combination factor, or it could just be, it could just be that drivers are they're just getting tired. They're just more willing to file complaints. So it could be something that's not so much that it's coercion has gone up. It's not that, it's not that employers or warehouses or 3PLs are getting any more or less scrupulous. It could just be that they're starting to file more complaints. They're just kind of worn out. So, yeah. So that's what. What's
Especially
that,
when it
Thomas?
comes to, that's a wonderful question you've got there, because when it comes to
Yeah.
coercion, I remember having to go through the training for it, and at a large carrier, it is definitely a tricky situation, because if you're putting them on these loads and they say, well, I'm tired, sometimes, especially with the coercion rules, either they are tired or they can state that they just don't want the forced dispatch load assigned to them. There always was this thing where, you got to go with the safety option regardless as a large carrier, but it's interesting to see, like you said, whether this is the uptick is from drivers saying, hey, I'm not going to take it anymore, I've dealt with enough in the past few months, or if it's a situation where they're being forced to have to report it because the supply chain, the shippers, the brokers, and the carriers aren't setting them up for success. And I think that'd be a really great thing to dive into, because for a lot of these drivers, like you said, you have a 14-hour clock, 11 hours of drive time. Imagine just sitting on the road for 11 hours per day with a minimum of 5 days per week just to struggle to get by. A lot of these folks are going to be extremely tired.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if you guys saw the that John Oliver piece from a week ago. I think Tim Dooner did a piece on that where he kind of goes in that whole fatigue thing is he's got a whole bunch of clips of these drivers being forced to drive past their hours. The one thing I did notice in those was that if you saw the video, the YouTube video that he put up there, it was a couple of them were, one was from 2014, one was from 2017. So that was sort of, you could say it's sort of that's 7 years ago, but again, so in other words, you could argue that maybe that's not as big a problem, but I don't know. According to the data that we found here that FMCSA gave me, it's going to be these complaints are going to be twice as much. So it definitely is still an issue.
John, when we're looking at the complaints coming in, do you potentially think that a big factor could also be that just the tightening that we saw in the capacity, and so just this huge demand for drivers compared to times of like maybe a freight recession where a lot of those drivers, a lot of carriers are really looking for more business, but when we're looking at this environment where there's a lot more optionality for a lot of drivers, that they can just kind of feel a little bit more emboldened, a little bit more empowered to say, you know what, this isn't it for me, compared to times where it's just like a freight recession. It's just like, you know what, I'll just do what I can.
Yeah. I thought about that too, like how much the economy was playing into this. And I agree, that could be it too. I'm wondering though, it'll be interesting to see, Anthony, like if in these complaints, I don't know how much they gave, like I said, they gave me the stats, but I didn't get to read any of them. And I don't know, we might be able to get more insight into the specific reasons if these complaints provide give ways to explain why they're doing, instead of just checking off a box. So if that would be a way to find out a little bit more about exactly what's causing it, or just getting in touch with some more experts just to see if what they might be seeing out there. I mean, it could very well be just a combination of factors that's hard to pin down exactly why.
I think it's very important also to find, as we look into that data and dive through it, just to see, I wonder if it's by carrier size. I wonder, like you said, if there's more to it as to what these drivers are. I remember it was always a headache if we had a potential coercion issue at an enterprise level, because then legal has to get involved, and then you have to literally go through and interview like 5 or so people who were part of the decision-making process, as well as, it gets to be a really big deal, at least on the large carrier side. You want to avoid that at all costs, because you are forced dispatching drivers where they can't just say no. And then you could sell them a lease and make them a lease and owner operator, then they get to choose their freight. But I'm interested in that predatory leasing task force, because that was always one way you could dangle the stick, and you could say, well, I know you really don't like the fact that we've given you a lot of bad loads randomly because you're in a market, but here's this lightly used truck for twice as much value that will get you to pay for it.
Yeah. That task force, that's going to be interesting. I think they're going to be looking a lot on the drayage side too, to see how much because I think that was been a big area of complaint. It was from the drayers being the drayage drivers being into these forced into these lease purchase agreements. So they're supposed to, that rule requires that they come up with a report in 2 years. So it'll be interesting to see the conclusions they get out of that.
Awesome, John. Well, it definitely sounds like this is a developing situation. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Looking forward to more content around this topic. We'll check in with you next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, you guys.